it water with the sheep in the box?
I hope you're doing well, and I hope you're as sick and tired as I am of being lied to about everything all the time. Your history is lied about in order to control your future. I'm sick and tired of it, and I'm going to help you break out of the matrix of Marxist delusions that have birthed our self-destructive modern culture.
To use America's mistakes as the brush with which to paint the entirety of its history while completely ignoring the indigenous lifestyle of barbarism and borderline evil is inaccurate at best, dishonest at worst.
The best TV shows and movies are the ones where characters are faced with moral quandaries that explore the gray area between good and evil. People like to imagine what they would do in those situations and can easily see themselves on either side. In real life though, we fit people into black and white categories. A decision is either right or wrong, and someone is either good or evil. We often want to categorize people so much that we'll create a fictionalized version of that person in order to shove them into one of those two boxes. Christopher Columbus is one of those people.
So, standard narrative. I took a course on race relations when I was in college, and this is what I was taught, a bunch of nonsense. White Europeans came and slaughtered all of the native populations of the Americas. Said native populations were kumbaya, living in harmony with nature, peaceful, lovely people.
Hey, so there aren't many Native Americans around nowadays, right? I wonder why that is. Well, if you're educated in the West, honestly it's probably not something you're all that sure on or really care about, because as we've previously covered in the other two videos in this series, which at this point are over a year old, Western education has a rather conspicuous bias towards venerating the great victories of the imperial powers and glossing over their shameful actions. This is why in the UK we're more than happy to learn about the two world wars because they were justified, and when it comes to the Second World War, actually morally upstanding. But we don't learn so much about the atrocities committed in the name of the British Empire throughout Africa and much of Asia because, well, we want our kids to be patriotic, right? It's rather difficult to remain patriotic when you become aware of those atrocities and genocides carried out by your home nation in the past. This is an almost uniquely European problem. We have a lot of hang-ups about our imperialist past, so we do our best to try and suppress those facts being widely discussed. Today, however, we need to discuss how the ancestors of those settlers of European origin feel the need to whitewash their own history and the ways in which they seek to exonerate a bunch of murderous pieces of shit for, frankly, as far as I can see, very little reason other than saving face and not wanting to face up to all that white guilt. Most famously in recent memory is the debate over Christopher Columbus and his legacy. Many people in the US have been arguing for decades that Columbus, contrary to American mythology, was not in fact a benevolent visionary who wanted to provide a new and prosperous life for his people, but a monster who sought to exploit and destroy the mostly peaceful and extremely outmatched native population. There has been a recent push to acknowledge this fact and stop celebrating a murderer in the same way that there has been a recent push to tear down statues of Confederate generals, strongly resisted of course by the definitively very smart people on Fox News and YouTube who just sort of cry about how people are mean to a man who began a genocide and systematic extermination campaign of an entire race of people.
Reason, tolerance, free inquiry, those are Western civilization's central gifts to this world. It shouldn't surprise us that in places where the West is under attack, those very principles are under attack too. So when they come for the Columbus statue in your town, it's worth fighting back, because it's not about the statue, it's about something much deeper.
So what's the truth? Well, let's go through each of the main points of contention in order, shall we? This is probably the one you'll see most often used against the mainstream interpretation of the facts. Hardcore nationalists and right-wingers will try to deny the systematic murder and attempted extermination of the native population of the Americas. That's to be expected, of course. The right-wing have a long history of pretending that historical atrocities didn't happen, including the guy Ariel Scarcella proudly cites and platforms in one of her videos about the gays, but I'm sure that's just a coincidence.
I found this video by a user named Styx. He makes a lot of great points in this video where he talks about why he thinks the rate of LGBT acceptance is down.
Zyklon B, that when I was a kid they always said, yeah, they gassed him with Zyklon B. The problem being Zyklon B is actually a delousing agent. It's a mostly harmless chemical. You would have to get it all over yourself. The thing is, these handprints that people talk about on the walls and so forth, they can't even prove they're contemporary to the time period. The famous Auschwitz shower was quite literally a showering station. What's not clear is if this was a deliberate extermination effort on a grand scale, or whether they were primarily focusing on eliminating criminals and the sick.
It's like their main thing at this point. Sean made a whole video about the fact that, yes, Europeans absolutely did their level best to exterminate the native population, up to and including deliberately using the spread of disease in order to further this goal, so I won't go over it all again here, because if you watch my content, there is a 99% chance that you've already seen it, although for those who haven't, I will leave a link in the description and I would recommend that you go watch it. But honestly, does anyone really believe that it was just a pure coincidence that the apparently accidental disease just so happened to result in the Europeans gaining almost all the land and power in the Americas, when there is evidence of them putting the natives into essentially concentration camps and slavery, and actively and provably orchestrating their genocide, as corroborated by various first-hand historical sources? How many interactions between the Europeans and natives are officially known as massacres, for fuck's sake? I don't know about you, but I've rarely seen an outbreak of disease referred to as a massacre. This talking point is repeated a lot by a lot of right-wingers and ignorant centrists, from Stefan Molyneux to Knowing Better to Tucker Carlson, fresh off of calling immigrants dirty invaders, and it's just a flat-out lie. It's a direct contradiction of the facts and can be disproved by producing various primary historical sources, but the problem is that much like most far-right conspiracy bullshit, it requires sources and a lengthy explanation to debunk, and therefore is not as convincing as a lie that can be explained away in one or two buzz phrases like, actually it was disease. It requires so much debunking that people don't want to listen, and the simpler explanation is just easier to understand and accept for a lot of people. Take PragerU, for example. I occasionally make response videos to PragerU, and in the last one it took me 1 hour and 40 minutes to debunk 5 5-minute long videos, because it takes 4 times as long to debunk as to just put the lies out there in the first place. And honestly, who clicks on a feature-length video on YouTube? Actually, that's a good point. Maybe I should stop making them. Or maybe not. Fuck you. Maybe I like my content being unwatchable. This is another of their favourite arguments, especially when it comes to Columbus. Columbus, as we all know, paved the way for the transatlantic slave trade, and that was one of his less monstrous acts, but often when it comes to the enslavement of the native peoples, or the criticism of the settlers for their actions in doing so, a common rebuttal is to immediately pivot and start claiming that actually it was fine because the native populations had practiced slavery for centuries before the settlers arrived. So why is everyone being so inconsistent in attacking this group of slave havers, but not this one? Is it because one of them did it on an industrial scale, treated their slaves so poorly that the transatlantic slave trade has been referred to on multiple occasions as the greatest crime ever committed in history, and the main purpose of the enslavement of these people was primarily profit and forced labour? This argument, other than being a failed attempt at moral equivalence that frankly doesn't stand up to any degree of scrutiny, makes the classic mistake in claiming that actually the natives were also bad, or what I call the Pocahontas argument.
Like you and me, which means they must be evil. They're savages, savages. Barely even human. Savages, savages. Killers at the core. They're different from us, which means they can't be trusted. We must sound the drums of war.
And it isn't based on a huge amount of historical facts, shall we say. For a start, it's a misnomer and really rather stupid to claim that the natives practiced slavery, because the natives were not a cohesive, unified culture by any stretch of the imagination, and as a result there was a wide variety of slavery going on. In general, Native Americans did not buy and sell captives before the colonists arrived, because they didn't have currency, and the treatment of those slaves was often night and day in comparison to the European treatment of native and African slaves, considering that whilst, yes, some slaves were brutally treated, in other cases Native American slaves were allowed to live on the fringes of Native American society until they were slowly integrated into the tribe. As a result, it's impossible to generalize. Depending on the tribe, captives could be enslaved for life, killed, or adopted into the tribe. Sometimes tribes adopted captives to replace warriors killed during a raid, where they were expected to fill the roles of the departed loved ones, to fit into the societal shoes of the dead relative and maintain the spirit power of the tribe. So captured individuals were sometimes allowed to assimilate into the tribe and would later produce a family within the tribe. The Creek, who engaged in this practice and had a matrilineal system, treated children born of slaves and Creek women as full members of their mothers' clans and of the tribe, as property, and hereditary leadership passed through the maternal maternal line. In the cultural practices of the Iroquoian peoples, also rooted in a matrilineal system with men and women having equal value, any child would have the status determined by the woman's clan. More typically, tribes took women and children captives for adoption, as they were believed to be able to adapt more easily into new ways of living. Whilst, yes, slavery is always bad, and I'm not going to act like it's okay because they generally treated them better than the chattel slaves the Europeans brought over to the Americas, it is important to point out that the two are not really comparable. One of the most notable things about the transatlantic slave trade was its scale, cruelty, and perhaps most egregiously, brutal efficiency. When the Europeans arrived, Native Americans changed their practice of slavery dramatically, selling war captives to Europeans rather than integrating them into their own societies as before. A lot of the time, when proponents of this idea bring up the apparent brutality of the native peoples and their system of slavery, they fail to notice that it's erroneous, much like when they argue that some African warlords sold fellow Africans to the Europeans and into the slave trade, because it's the influence of the Europeans and the dominance of the new system of slavery that created this shift. As the demand for labour in the West Indies grew with the cultivation of sugarcane, Europeans exported enslaved Native Americans to the so-called Sugar Islands. Historian Alan Galley estimates that between 1670 and 1715, between 24,000 and 51,000 captive Native Americans were exported as free labour. Galley also says the trade in Indian slaves was at the centre of the English Empire's development in the American South. The trade in Indian slaves was the most important factor affecting the South in the periods 1670 to 1715. Accurate records of the numbers enslaved do not exist. Slaves became a caste of people who were foreign to the English, Native Americans, Africans and their descendants, and non-Christians. The Virginia General Assembly defined some terms of slavery in 1705 thusly: all servants imported and brought into the country who are not Christians in their native country shall be accounted and shall be slaves. All Negro, mulatto, and Indian slaves within this dominion shall be held to be real estate. If any slave resists his master correcting such slave and shall happen to be killed in such correction, the master shall be free of all punishment, as if such accident never happened. Jesus fucking Christ, that's... fuck me. Of course, as we went over in the last entry into this series, a major difference between Native Americans enslaving one another and European settlers enslaving them, other than the brutal efficiency with which the slave trade operated, was that much like the African slaves which were later brought over to the Americas, the natives were seen as genetically inferior, unable to be integrated into society, unfit to exist, racially predisposed to servitude. There was malice and ideology behind those actions. It's hardly surprising, in this context, that the scale was so much larger, given that while the natives took slaves from captured warriors, or to fill a specific role in the tribe, most of the time they allowed them to integrate into the community, and of course, due to the fact that they were the same race, didn't see them as racially inferior in any way. Genetically, at least, they were on even standing. This argument I see disappointingly frequently, usually accompanied by "the Europeans brought civilization to the Americas," as if that fucking means anything. Yeah, I'm sure that the introduction of economics and technology totally makes up for the literally centuries of oppression, slavery, massacres, land seizures, and yes, a genocide that almost completely wiped them out in the eyes of the native people. Let's actually look at that, shall we? Over a period of just over 100 years, the colonizers stole 1.5 billion acres of land and killed more than 80% and by as much as 98% of the native population, approximately 130 million people in some areas. According to geographers from University College London, the colonization of the Americas by the Europeans killed so many people it resulted in climate change and global cooling. UCL geography professor Mark Maslin, one of the co-authors of the study, said the large death toll also boosted the economies of Europe. The depopulation of the Americas may have allowed the Europeans to dominate the world. It also allowed the Industrial Revolution and for Europeans to continue that domination. So that's what this argument is up against. In order for the positives to take precedent when talking about this issue, they would have to outweigh the negatives, and, well, do they? The answer is of course no, or at least in my opinion, but if you can think of any, please feel free to put them in the comments. I'd love to know which great positives can balance these atrocities out. Yeah, it's really not though, is it? but even if it was, would that make it okay? When should we stop bringing up old wounds? Is there a specific number of years? I mean, there has to be some cutoff. After all, we don't exactly get too cut up about the Gothic Wars or the sacking of Rome, do we? But the problem is, if there's a cutoff in terms of a specific number of years, where is it? Because obviously, we need to talk about the legacy of European imperialism, slavery, and yes, the Native American genocide, and also the subjugation of Ireland by the British, but that's a topic for the next one of these videos, which, judging by how long it took for me to make a part 3, will probably be another year at least. So, is there a specific number of years in the same way as copyright works? Well, obviously that's up for debate, but my view on it is that there is no specific time for it, but that the metric for when we stop talking about historical events in relation to our modern world is quite simply when the legacy of those events no longer affects and harms people in the present. To that end, let's discuss both how the Native American genocide continues to affect and harm people in the present, and how, in effect, it never really ended. Cheery stuff, I know. For a start, as we covered in the colonialism episode of this series, all the land and resources stolen from the native people was not returned, nor were they compensated for it. The reservations are for the most part left alone, but that's a frankly minuscule amount of land in comparison to what was stolen. You can't commit a genocide and then expect the remaining members of the victimized group to just go back to the way they were before, especially when you stole all the land and resources that might help them rebuild and engage in casual violence against them. Likewise, you can't attempt to stamp out what remains of native culture by forcing children into so-called Indian residential schools, which existed specifically to destroy the traditions and culture by pushing children into exclusively engaging with white Western culture, and to, as Richard Henry Pratt, an army officer who developed the Carlisle Indian School, the first of these schools, once put it, kill the Indian to save the man. But that's just historical mistreatment, which, don't get me wrong, is relevant and important, and certainly contributes to the high rates of addiction, mental issues, and suicides among the native population, not to mention the astronomically high rate of assaults native women suffer mostly at the hands of white people. But much like the ongoing mistreatment of black people in the US, the war on the natives is still being waged, just in more subtle ways. As the quote goes, the Indian Wars never ended. The land grabs and attempt to take over the tiny amount of land the natives still hold onto are still going on, from the conflict at Standing Rock, in which a pipeline carrying oil, the substance possibly most responsible for the most bloodshed in recent history, was suggested to be erected through sacred and apparently legally owned land via various treaties, but a treaty is only as useful as the willingness of the government not to violate it, or the spirit of it, and considering the amount of sway oil money has over the US government, well, this was inevitable, really. Now, the really egregious part about this is that originally, the pipeline was intended to cross government land, across a river which supplied a major town, populated mostly by white people, in North Dakota, but was deemed too dangerous due to the risk of a spill contaminating the water, a concern not raised when the suggestion was made to reroute it through Native American land. Strangely enough, I guess they can go fuck themselves. Who cares if a few natives suffer due to an oil spill? This project is worth billions. $3.8 billion to be exact. That's capitalism for you. Money is more important than people's lives, and some people's lives are worth less than others, right? Technically, the pipeline doesn't directly violate Indian territory, since it passes under the Missouri River half a mile north of the reservation of the Standing Rock tribe. Even so, it interferes with old tribal burial sites and other culturally important land, and this on top of the Oahe Dam, built downstream on the river almost 60 years previously, which flooded 200,000 acres of Indian land, displacing many thousands of people and obliterating settlements. So it's pretty clear that the local government had very little regard for the well-being and or safety of these people. We all know what happened next, of course. The government sent in the army, a private security firm pepper-sprayed children, engaged in intimidation tactics, and in the process demonstrated that regardless of whatever rights and treaties you may have, capitalists and the government can and will violate them as and when it pleases, and if you resist, they will throw the fucking army at you until you have no choice but to give in and submit to the will of capital. Predictably, of course, the pipeline, which the protesters had warned could overflow and ruin their sacred land, something the government and capital had insisted was very unlikely, despite deeming the risk too high to be placed near a predominantly white population area, leaked 383,000 gallons of oil a few months later, coating approximately half an acre of wetland after its construction was finally approved by North Dakota Supreme Court. And that was only the beginning. As recently as March this year, Donald Trump revoked the reservation status for 300 acres of land settled by the Wampanoag tribe, potentially setting a precedent for a new wave of native land grabs by the current administration and a further crippling of their rights and sovereignty. As LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, a preservation officer for the Standing Rock tribe, wrote, "The US government is wiping out our most important cultural and spiritual areas. As it erases our footprint from the world, it erases us as a a people. These sites must be protected or our world will end. It is that simple. Our young people have a right to know who they are. They have a right to language, to culture, to tradition. So this is a weird one. It's been floating around the right-wing outraged sphere for a while now, which is unsurprising considering their penchant for conspiracy theories and other nonsense, as demonstrated by Alex Jones, Paul Joseph Watson and David Icke. It could be argued that all right-wing philosophy and political thought requires at least a level of delusion and conspiratorial thinking, because if it didn't, it might be difficult to justify something like cultural Marxism, the Jewish question, or the idea of a capitalist meritocracy. Most of their positions are, to a greater or lesser extent, based on outright lies and or misinformation, from the causes of crime to bullshit immigration statistics to their current hysteria around gender and the biological essentialism shite they're insistent on peddling, despite knowing very little about it and not bothering to learn. Conservatives really like their bullshit traditions and get really triggered when those traditions are questioned, recontextualized, or in any way criticized by the people most harmed by them. This has been happening more and more recently, from the tearing down of statues of Confederate generals, most of which were only erected in the first place to intimidate civil rights protesters in the 1960s, to the furore over the Washington Redskins and their mascot and also name. This isn't solely an American thing either. In my hometown there's a pub called the Black Boy that was prevented from reopening because of its name and the history behind it. So it's no surprise that these people would get really unreasonably mad over people starting to question the validity and morality of celebrating the actions of one of history's greatest monsters rather than memorializing the human beings he murdered and the race he enslaved and tried to exterminate, but leave it to Tucker Carlson to go off on one about white American culture being under attack after someone asked nicely to stop venerating a genocidal maniac. Let's take a look, shall we?
Well, good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson tonight. So the left has finally found the only immigrant in history who had no right to come to America. The only one who didn't improve the place by his presence. His name? Christopher Columbus. His crime? Violating the sovereignty of the people who lived here already. Plus, he was the wrong ethnicity. Now, try making that argument about any other immigrant to America and see how long you keep your job. But whatever. Happy Columbus Day anyway. Enjoy it while you can. Your grandchildren won't even know it existed. Progressives had declared war on Christopher Columbus, as they have on most things older than last week. This is year zero on the revolutionary calendar. History starts now. Ignorance of the past isn't simply tolerated, it's required. Now, you could make those arguments to liberals if you wanted to, but save your breath. They don't care, because none of this is really about Christopher Columbus. What we're watching is a full-scale assault from within on the West itself, its history, its political and intellectual legacy. It's not a debate where one side tries to convince the other. It's a war, with one side trying to erase all remnants of its opponent, in this case, Western civilization. Reason, tolerance, free inquiry, those are Western civilization's central gifts to this world. It shouldn't surprise us that in places where the West is under attack, those very principles are under attack too. So when they come for the Columbus statue in your town, it's worth fighting back, because it's not about the statue. It's about something much deeper.
Weirdly, he takes part in the same rhetoric that many defenders of colonialism think is really smart, but in actuality exposes them for the far-right numbskulls that they are by comparing Columbus's invasion, violent takeover, slave empire, and genocidal actions to immigration, and accepting asylum seekers into the USA. I thought that was what all this stuff about huddled masses was about, but I guess Lady Liberty can go fuck herself, right? This is the sort of pathetic gotcha attempted by a desperate middle-aged man who doesn't understand any of the facts at play but has lots of opinions on the situation nonetheless. It's an uncle bringing up the blacks at Thanksgiving dinner sort of situation. Being extremely far right, he doesn't see, of course, that immigrants and refugees are a net positive for the economy, commit less crime than the white population, and the entire point of the USA is to be a melting pot of different cultures, unless, as we discussed, he thinks the Statue of Liberty is full of shit. But the point that's particularly egregious here is that he seems to think that a violent and brutal occupation of territory, enslavement and murder of the locals, and carrying out of a genocide is in any way comparable to desperate, hard-working Latin American refugees looking for a better life and or fleeing a war zone, doing all the jobs white Americans don't want to, paying taxes, and enduring horrendous bigotry at the hands of people like Tucker. So the implication here is that Tucker sees refugees as an invading force rather than just people wanting a better life, which is pretty yikes, but can also be used with any invasion in history, and all of a sudden Tucker Carlson is suggesting that Hitler's invasion of Poland is comparable to these kids trying to escape violence and conflict in their home countries.
Well, good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson tonight. So the left has finally found the only immigrant in history who had no right to come to
Poland.
The only one who didn't improve the place by his presence. His name?
Adolf Hitler.
His crime? Violating the sovereignty of the people who lived here already. Plus, he was the wrong ethnicity. Now try making that argument about any other immigrant to
Poland
and see how long you keep your job. But whatever. Happy
Adolf Hitler.
Day anyway. Enjoy it while you can. Your grandchildren won't even know it existed. Progressives had declared war on
Adolf Hitler,
as they have on most things older than last week. This is year zero on the revolutionary calendar. History starts now. Ignorance of the past isn't simply tolerated, it's required.
And then there's a bunch of unhinged white genocide great replacement shit about Western culture being under attack by the left. Cultural Marxism. Fox News is pushing the Nazi conspiracy theory of cultural Marxism now. Fuck me. I can't say I'm surprised considering Carlson's track record though. As I mentioned in my previous videos on the subject, the West has a guilt complex over the atrocities it carried out during its long history, and the legacy of those actions that still continue to this day. There are a number of ways to respond to this, just as there are a number of ways to respond to any kind of guilt over past actions, but the main three are mostly dependent on ideology. The right will insist that actually there's no need to feel in any way guilty because it was so long ago. It's not the current generations of people who are responsible, and besides, it was probably a good thing in the end. After all, these people didn't have objectively good Western civilization before the Europeans arrived. All these cucks trying to make you feel bad are doing is trying to diminish your pride in your European heritage. We on the left, of course, seek to repair and reverse the damage done and certainly prevent the legacy continuing to harm people in the present and moving forward. And the liberals generally acknowledge that some bad stuff happened and it's unfortunate, but what can we even do? It was so long ago. Let it go already. Besides, they have all the same legal rights as the rest of us, just like the blacks, so let's not give it any more thought than that or consider any additional nuance. The Native American genocide was an atrocity that continues to stain the US's history and legacy, notably when the US government tries to take the moral high ground against other dictatorships or authoritarian regimes, and especially when Americans try to lecture other cultures about their history. Much like a lot of the European dominance in the modern world was built on the exploitation of much of Africa and Asia, the US's status as a world power began with a genocide and then, as we mentioned last time, compounded by the transatlantic slave trade. The legacy of the genocide is still evident today and is still affecting many Native Americans still in the US as their land is threatened, protections are removed, their treaties are ignored in favour of white people and capitalists' interests, and they are being attacked and subjected to astonishing amounts of violence, both systemic and individual. Christopher Columbus was a monster. His actions were unforgivable and his legacy is centuries of pain, suffering and death. Nice to know that the biggest news corporation in the most powerful country in the world stands by Nazi conspiracy theories and genocide denial. What a time to be alive.
Not an argument!
Hello everyone, I can guarantee that you weren't expecting another one of these because the last one I did was... Actually, I'm gonna look up the date because it was a long time ago. Let's have a look. The last... Wow. Okay. The last video in this series premiered on the 23rd of February 2019. But anyway, as I said, thanks for watching everyone. I hope you enjoyed. And hello to my new subscribers who decided to follow me after Noah Fintz shared my video on his Twitter. As I said in that video, I am going to be doing a few more reaction videos in the near future. However, the majority of my videos are more sort of political kind of video essays, philosophical diatribes, that kind of thing. I do hope you stick around though, and I do hope you enjoyed this video if so. And if you are new, you may be wondering what all the names on screen are right now. Well, if you watch any YouTube, you're probably aware because this isn't exactly an original idea that I've got here, but basically these are my patrons, people who give me money each month with which I can buy food. So you can join them if you like. The link to my Patreon will be in the description, and if you donate $5 or more to me a month, you do get videos 2 days earlier than they get uploaded to YouTube most of the time, unless it's some kind of time sensitive thing, like with the Ariel Scarcella one. I didn't upload it early just because I wanted to get it out as quickly as possible while it was still relevant. But most of the time you will get those videos 2 days early, and I will read out your name over the end credits as well. Allow me to demonstrate. So today I especially want to thank Calliope, Chris Ragnacci, Emily, Ephrey Jeffstein, Nancy Cambe. Next we have Ryan at Brian at Sprine, Pixels Green, Stacey Solano, Susie M, Theodore Pekeloff, Thomas McCallum, Tom Newport, and Wikibitch. I was going to say hope you're having a good lockdown. That's probably quite a strange thing to say. Anyway, thanks for watching everyone, and I'll see you next time.